Thanks for making it to the webinar today. So we'll keep it for about 30 minutes, followed by the Q&A session. And today, what I'm going to talk about is it's a topic, it's a theme that's very close to my heart, and directly comes from my experience for about 6 years doing product management. Is how to build effective product teams that focus on delivery, right? And for the next 30 minutes, we are going to go through four set of different sessions, which are divided for about 7 to 8 minutes each. And I'm going to touch about four things in total. So before we take off into the presentation, first, let's talk about what is the first about 0 to 1 product management and product delivery, and how I think about how to scale the products, whether it's a startup or an enterprise company or a high growth company. Followed by that, we are going to touch upon an interesting aspect that I learned through my work experience, which is how product discovery is actually sort of hidden inside product delivery and vice versa. That would be an interesting aspect, and I look forward to any questions on that. The third topic that we are going to cover today is that how to make sure your entire team collaborates on finalizing your minimum viable product. And when I say everyone on the team, I literally mean all the stakeholders. And I'll also share why is that so important for product delivery. Lastly, if you're a budding product manager or looking forward to get into product management, one of the key things that is expected from most of the product managers that are dealing with stakeholders is how to communicate trade-offs without harming delivery. Always remember that product delivery will be as good as your communication skills with the stakeholders. So we are not going to basically leave out stakeholders. We're going to understand how to communicate with them so as to make sure that the product delivery is on time. So that's for today. So we're going to get started into the first topic, which is, so what do we mean by product delivery? It's quite simple, but I would like to emphasize on the definition first before we dive into what it means to deliver a product. So product delivery is iterative steps to continue delivering finished features into users' hands, right? One thing to emphasize is continued delivery, which means that you're never finished, right? There is no starting point and there's no end point. You're always learning from your users, always finding out the next features, and always trying to find out that what is the next big thing I can give to my users that is also meaningful to the business. So you continue delivery of the finished features into users' hand, and that's what is product delivery. Now, you must have heard of this term a lot, that, hey, we are building a product which is 0 to 1. Hey, we are a young startup that we are building the product from 0 to 1. And that's kind of true for startup companies. And this is a concept that you might have learned in multiple books and from multiple speakers. The 0 to 1 concept basically tells you that you can start from scratch and build the minimum viable product that delivers some value to the user, right? What you see on the right is that there are two ways to build products. One is you build it incrementally. So in this example, you could build something for the user that cannot be used by the user till it's finally out. So if you see in the top example, the user has to wait till the product is out in the fourth incremental product delivery sprint till they actually can get to use it. In an iterative product development, every step is useful to the user. So if you compare number one in incremental and number one in iterative, in number one in incremental is basically not useful to the user, but you have spent so much time building it. While in the iterative process, the first thing that you build is useful to the user. In this example, it's a knife. It's still useful to the user. Maybe it's not the final product that you ever wanted, but still you can start getting feedback from the user, right? And this step from 1 to 4 is basically what we call 0 to 1. And why do we have to stop at 1? Even if there is something smaller you can build for the user, and I call it 0.1, as long as it delivers some value to the user, I think if your business processes are efficient and seamless enough, you should even build the point one product feature as long as it's useful to the user. Now, if you're wondering, what is this point one product feature that we're talking about? I heard of 0 to 1, but not point one. Let me sort of define it for you before we go into it. The point one product is basically a micro viable product. It's even smaller than minimum viable product. Now, if we were to see a difference between what is the difference between a minimum viable product and micro viable product, this is how I would define it. Right now, a micro viable product that you see on the left, right, even long before you launch your MVP, right, which comes at on this particular axis, it comes on one. The point one, which is a viable product, actually gives you the earliest possible feedback on whether users would be interested in something you're building and whether you should even invest time in an MVP. A lot of product companies or product focused companies talk about, hey, we should have an MVP to test out the product market fit. But there is even more leaner way to do it. And the way you do it is you find out, even if you can do something smaller than a minimum viable product, to decide whether you should even invest money, resources, people into building a minimum viable product. Let me give you some examples of a micro viable product. For example, you're someone who's starting an AC repair business. You don't need to build an app, which is an MVP, to test whether users want it. You can actually just set up a call center at home, even if you're the only person that's on the call center, right? So you can set up a one-person call center to learn whether users would be interested in a call-to-home AC repair website or mobile app and what are their current pain points. See, you don't have to build an app. First, you find out whether users want this service. Another example is you are a founder and you're trying to build an app to make it easy for people to RSVP to an event, to know basically whether they'll make it to the event or not. Before building an app or before building an MVP, you can actually do a micro viable product. You can just send out Google Forms and you can iterate with the Google Forms. Maybe in some Google Forms, you have more information that you're asking for. In other Google Form, you have slightly more detailed information, and you can find out which works more, which works less, right? So the reason I'm introducing the concepts of minimum viable product, which you might have heard of, and a new concept that I'm introducing today, which is micro viable product, is that both of them are super important for product delivery. You don't have to build the perfect feature always. You always start with the smallest possible bit, right? In the world of product, you can always ship a feature which is meaningful to the user, but is still not an MVP. Let's go to the next part of our presentation today. So we just touched upon what is a 0 to 1 product, what's a MVP and a micro viable product. Now let's talk about some interesting things that will set the pace for our rest of the presentation. Now, you must have heard of Agile and waterfalls, right? Now, as a product manager, if you're working in a digital product management company, I'm telling you today that waterfalls are bad and Agile is good. And I'm talking about digital product management companies that depend on software engineering and software development to bring out products. Let me tell you why. Waterfalls are like relay race, right? So you have an idea. If you look in the diagram on the right, you do some analysis, you call your designers and you ask them, hey, you know what? I've just written this nice analysis. I've just written this product requirement document, right? And as per these mocks that you might have built in some of the product tools like Balsamiq, can you design a high fidelity design for me? And then after designers are done, you hand it over to your software development team to build it and then test it, and then the final product comes out. This is highly inefficient. And in my own experience, I've seen this happening in multiple companies where a bunch of documents are just being handed over from one team to another, right? And why waterfalls are not efficient? It's because just like I talked about the relay race, you cannot get started unless you get the baton, right? So you're always waiting for the baton. Unless you have the baton in your hand, you cannot progress, right? So one way to test, I'm just sharing one example. One way to test whether you're doing waterfalls in your organization is that if an engineering team has not been involved in creating the product requirement documents and they have to wait for product requirements in order to start development, you're probably doing waterfall. And this is true for so many companies. Now, what is the counter view? The counter view is agile, right? Now, this is a term that's thrown around a lot, is not completely understood, right? A lot of people go for certifications, a lot of people understand it on the job, but I'm just trying to sort of explain and understand how this pans out against a waterfall process. Now, agile is ever evolving and ever improving, but it's definitely not sequential. The design is not waiting for product. The engineering is not waiting for design and product. And the test team is not waiting for engineering team. So one way to know whether you're doing agile in your company, well, there's no easy answer, but are you always iterating with a micro MVP sort of a feature or a product instead of building that perfect rainbow feature that nobody might use? And there's no perfect feature if users haven't seen it yet, right? So ask the users in the simplest, smallest possible way, would you want more or less of this? Give them the smallest micro viable product or the minimum viable product, or it can just be a feature. And the users will tell you if this is good or not, and not you. A lot of product managers think that they can decide on behalf of the user, but you always ask the user whether this is good or not. On the right, one of the best ways to think about it is that it's a continuous loop. So you think and you make, right? And there is no clear boundary between when you think about what to build and finally you make it. Both actually feed into each other in a way. Let's come to the topic of the session today. So we just talked about how do you define a minimum viable product or a micro viable product, and what does that mean? We also just saw teams that do waterfall, teams that do agile, and how you can basically, from a thought process perspective, differentiate between them. Now, let's come down to product discovery and delivery. Product discovery, in very simple terms, is figuring out what to build. And product managers, product team members spend a lot of time in just creating requirements so that eventually they can give it to someone to deliver it. And that's product delivery process, which is building it. Now, these particular sentences that I've written on the slides are super important. If you're thinking of or thought of product discovery and delivery as two separate sequential things, you have been doing waterfall too. Also, if you have been thinking the fastest way to deliver feature is by quickly collecting the requirements from all the stakeholders and throwing it all on the engineers for delivery, actually it slows down the delivery, right? Let me explain you why. That thinking of discovery and delivery as a sequential process will slow down the product delivery. Now, from a thought process perspective, what I'm proposing in this presentation is that discovery is not separate from delivery and delivery is not separate from discovery. Let me give you an example. When you deliver a particular feature to the user, you learn if the users want more of it or less of it. And accordingly, you decide, okay, maybe I should not spend more time on that feature since users do not want it. Or you can even say, hey, the users love the feature, so I should build more of it. Either of the ways, you always depend on the user to tell you whether they like it or not. And this process never starts. And this is what I said right in the beginning, is that product delivery has no start point, has no end point. It's always evolving. And without shipping a feature, you're not discovering anything, right? There's this great article in this book called Rework by Jason Fried. He talks about the same concept, that if you have not shipped a feature, you're just spending time on building something that the users not have even seen, right? And you're trying to understand whether users will need it or not even before shipping it. So best is to ship, right, as fast as possible in order to know whether the users need it or not. So the discovery and delivery process sort of feed into each other rather than being two separate processes. So we talked about the definition of product delivery. How do you define the various stages of a product? And there is some sort of coherence between teams that do agile and hence think of product discovery and delivery as the same process. And there are some teams which are waterfall mostly that think of discovery and delivery as two different things. Let me get to the next part of the presentation, is that how to work on an MVP, or for that matter, on a micro viable product. Quoting these famous lines from Marty Kagan from Silicon Valley Product Group, if you want to discover great products, it really is essential that you get your ideas in front of real users and customers early and often. If you want to deliver great products, you want to use best practices for engineering and not try to override the engineers' concerns. Continuing, if you're just using your engineers to code, you're only getting about half their value. I couldn't agree more, right? The reason I'm quoting these lines from Marty Kagan is because of this. Let me take an example, and as it's mentioned on the slide as well, this happens a lot. Closer to the launch of the product or the feature, your compliance team comes and tells you, hey, we cannot allow the users to do X. This leads to a spiral of ongoing, okay, let me get back to design to rethink about UI UX because compliance said I cannot do this. And then you inform the engineers, hey, we might have change in scope. And all of the above could have been avoided if compliance and engineering were in a single room before the PRD and designs were finalized, right? The bottom line is, the more you involve all stakeholders during the discovery process, and I'm specifically emphasizing the engineering team, the lesser the chances of delivery getting slowed down by constant change in scope later. Always understand that change in scope is the biggest enemy of delivery. And the only way you can get delivery on time is to avoid change in scope. And this can only happen when you had included all the stakeholders in the room when you were deciding on the product features and designs. Let me just read out on the left, I mentioned something on similar lines. A product manager that involves design, or in fact, any other stakeholder, after the PRD has been written, is pushing risk right to the end and preparing for possible scope changes in the PRD. And similarly, a product manager that involves engineering right at the end is risking delivery timelines. You need to involve the product engineers during the product discovery phase and not during the product delivery phase. And if you're not doing that, you're probably using 50% of what the engineers can do. Always remember, they are the ones building your product. So if you involve them in product discovery, they'll tell you things that you didn't even think about. Now, how to practically implement this, right? How to have everyone in the same room when you're building these product features. Let me give you some very practical examples. For example, you could invite design and engineering to the user interviews. Have you ever thought about it? Whenever you're talking to your users in interviews or focus group discussions, you could invite your design teams, your engineers to the user interviews. How tough that could be. You're anyways hosting the user interviews. You can call them in. You can form a Slack group with users, and the group should also have all the key stakeholders in a single Slack group. Invite your legal, invite your compliance, engineers, policy, research, design, everyone into the Slack group with the users, so they know that we are building it for the users at the end of the day. You can conduct MVP scoping workshop with business teams, product engineering, research, and design. And if you're building for iOS or Android and you're having design reviews, why should you not involve the mobile product engineers? You should involve the iOS or Android engineers into your design reviews. I know this is much more easier said than done, and it is super tough to get it implemented in companies, depending on the culture that's already been there for multiple years or months. I'm not saying that this is easily possible, but smaller changes, smaller iterative changes can make that culture shift within the teams. Let me give you an example of how you can host a workshop where everyone decides the MVP and not just the product people. First, you should understand, once you have written down the user stories after involving all the various stakeholders, you should measure the impact of each user story using a framework called Moscow framework that if you might have heard about, which basically divides user stories into must have, should have, could have, and will not have. Once you decide that which user story should be within which category, and as a team, involve everyone to sort of do this distribution of MSCW across your user stories, and then again invite engineering to ask them that, can you tell us how complex is each user story, because they are going to build it. We always keep talking about effort versus impact analysis in order to know whether what should be your MVP, but this is how you should be involving everyone and understanding effort and impact. Effort and impact is not done by just one person on an Excel sheet. It's done by the team as a whole. And before shortlisting MVP, do not forget to test whether it is worth investing in an MVP by doing a micro viable product. Coming to the last part of today's presentation is that I talked about a very important point, that it's not very easy to do this in multiple companies. If you have that culture, that's a great place to be for a product manager. If you do not have that culture of extreme collaborative workshops when you're deciding product features, and basically sort of crowdsourcing from your users that what is the next thing we want to build, the cultural shift is the most difficult thing. So that's why I want to touch upon that most important thing to product delivery is not just about involving engineers in a product discovery process, but also how to handle stakeholders, your senior management, your peers, everyone that you interact with, including the users. How do you communicate to them so that the product delivery is not harmed or disturbed? Now, as a product manager, you'll hear these things a lot. And I've just taken some generic often heard sentences, right, from different stakeholders. For example, we definitely want this feature in the MVP. You might hear it a lot. Or someone can say, hey, can you let us know how soon can you build Y, a product feature? And you will often hear this, that it's super important for the business to know X and Y both before the Z date. So basically what we are seeing here is that multiple stakeholders will be approaching you with urgency. Hey, this is super urgent. Hey, this is super important. Hey, can you do this? Hey, can you do that? How soon can you ship it? Saying yes or no to such a question is not the right approach, because the most important thing that you'll understand is that your stakeholders are your partners in product development. Instead of saying a yes or a no, you can sort of ask them. For example, let's take the first example. We definitely want this feature in the MVP. A way to answer is that if this feature is to be included in the MVP, we possibly will ship 1 month late. Can we discuss with the sponsors about this delay? Right? So the stakeholder understands that, it's just not about asking the product requirement. It has implication on the organization, and hence it requires a bigger discussion. Let's talk about next. Can you let us know how soon can you build Y? One way to handle is, I'll get back to you after discussing with my design and engineers, and I'll share a rough estimate. Because always remember that your product engineers and your product designers are your biggest partners in product development, and that's what will help you with the product delivery. Next, someone in the business can say, hey, can you build both X and Y for us before the Z date? Because there's a competitive scenario. You want to get something shipped out immediately. The best way to handle this conversation is, hey, which ongoing features we can deprioritize in order to prioritize the two new sudden requirements? The business stakeholders should know that everything comes at a cost. Everything is a trade-off. We do not have infinite engineering bandwidth or infinite product bandwidth for that matter. So if we have to prioritize something suddenly, we have to deprioritize something else. Right? And this is the right way to take conversation forward collaboratively, and basically for organizations to understand that everything basically deprioritize something else. Quickly, so even if you were, let's say, working with your architect and your construction workers to build this small room, your room also has trade-offs, right? For example, if you want a window, you cannot have the shelf. If you want the door to open inwards, your window has to move towards the left, right? As you see, this is a very simple way to understand that everything is a trade-off. So there's one stakeholder who wants the window. There's one stakeholder who wants the shelf. But if you bring them together in the room and tell them, hey, you know what? If you get the shelf in the room, the window has to move out. If you bring the window, then the shelf has to move out. right? So then everybody understands that we are an organization as a whole, and we are not just individual teams or individual functions. Another way to look at is that it's a three-dimensional pyramid where if you always prioritize business needs and technology needs, you will deprioritize the users, which you do not want for sure because you're building for the users. If you always prioritize users and your business needs, your how reliable is your product from a tech perspective? Basically the quality will be harmed because you're not focusing on the engineering part of it. If you're always focusing on the users and engineering, your business might not be happy because you're not listening to their timelines. So always remember that when you choose something, there's always a trade-off. Another way is time, quality, and cost. Now this is something which always comes up when you're working with the design and engineering teams. If as a product manager you're telling your engineering team, hey, this needs to ship out fast, we're running out of time. So if you're really firm on the time, then you have to choose that which of the quality or the cost are you planning to deprioritize, right? For example, are you okay with a low quality product? We definitely, anyone can ship product in a small time possible, but it will harm the quality. Or if you want the quality and the cost to be low and quality to be high, you cannot get done it sooner. The time that it will take to deliver the product will be really high, right? Sort of summarizing about stakeholder management, when you talk about product delivery and the various trade-offs, the key to ensure timely product delivery is that you ensure we prioritize for the user and not only for the specific business functions. You always have to keep iterating it to the business, to the organization. The second thing to ensure is that you ensure that all stakeholders think of every product feature request as either a trade-off or a chance to revisit delivery timelines that requires a regroup with other stakeholders. So every stakeholder should realize that whenever they are presenting a particular feature request, it will either deprioritize something else, or if we cannot deprioritize something else, then we have to talk about timelines because then we cannot ship it on time. The third thing, quite important, is if you keep doing this in practice, one thing that your stakeholders will start understanding is organization is one living organism. And you cannot prefer a body part of one living organism over the other because everything is important. So you ensure that stakeholders treat organization as one living organism where a push for a product feature from one team can deprioritize a feature that is requested by another team. And hence, it is always important to involve everyone, including your engineers, in user interviews, story writing, concept testing, research, when you're doing your feasibility test, all of that. And always communicate that engineering bandwidth is an asset. There are no infinite engineers. And in an ideal world, we could have infinite engineers and we could keep on building, keep on piling up every possible feature request. But that's not possible in the real world. We always have to communicate that engineering bandwidth is an asset. Summarizing what we learned from today's session. First of all, you think about the zero point 0.1 feature before directly moving to build the MVP. Always remember, before MVP, there's another step, a micro viable product. Secondly, product discovery and delivery are the two sides of the same coin. You always deliver to the user so that you can discover what they want. And you always continue discovering so that you can understand what to deliver, right? So the engineering team is not separate from a research team. Both of them should be in the same room so that a researcher can look at the user pain points, whereas an engineer can look at the complexity of building it. And maybe they can come up with even greater ideas that you never thought about. The thirdly, involve all stakeholders in the discovery process so that delivery is less risky and you can deliver on time. And always talk in the language of trade-offs rather than piling up on product features, and none of them might even get delivered. So always talk about trade-offs, always talk about we can deliver this on time, but there should be no scope change, for example, and so forth. So that's my 30 minutes, and hope you enjoyed the talk. And I can open it for questions now.
Yes. Thank you so much, Badanjot. Yes. Leave your screen on for now. You might use this
Okay.
in the section answers, question answer section. Really, our users, like our viewers, are saying that they really appreciate your presentation. That you made some really great and useful points there. So let's start
Thank
with
you.
some questions. So Varun is asking, they want X and Y before Z, but also don't want to deprioritize anything else. Result is PMs and engineers slogging for extended hours. Is this a common practice or just toxic work culture?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question, right? So again, it's this is not something that we have never heard of, right? It happens in multiple organizations that business always wants X, Y, and Z. Z is already in development, and they also want X and Y, right? But the only way to have that conversation with the business is when you keep the communication channel open between business and product. One of the ways you can change the culture in the organization, if this is happening in the organization, is to include the business stakeholders at the point in time when you are actually finalizing product requirements, so they know that any product requirement that they were part of will take X amount of time. Now, if they were never aware about the estimation or complexity of the task, they will never understand why we cannot build X, Y, and Z together. So, this means that the culture in the company basically is not encouraging business to get involved in the engineering processes. They just are worried about let's ship everything possible. So, always involve business and engineering together so that business can appreciate where engineers come from, engineers can appreciate where business comes from.
Thank you. Yeah, just a reminder to our viewers and listeners, yeah, fire away your questions. This is the time to use this opportunity. So next question is coming from Sankar Ganesh. He's saying, if we are building something from ground, it's very hard to have the whole team start from day one or at the same time and at the same point. Do you have any recommendations or orders to follow?
Yeah. Okay. I think as the product grows or as the features grow or as you scale up, the team also grows. On day one, you're absolutely right. You might not have even the entire product team, right? And I know about small companies which the same person is the founder and same person is also the coder, right? So they are one person teams that have actually been building products. So you're right. So if on day zero you do not have the entire team, think about the easiest possible ways for you to know what to build for the users. Even if you have no research team, let's say, or do not have designers, I will quote an example of Dropbox. The first MVP product of Dropbox was just a video. They posted a video on their website explaining the concept of Dropbox. It was not even a product, and users wanted that product to be built. Even if you're one person, you can think about these small, hacky, scrappy ways in which you can still find out what the users want without building the product. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Thank you. Yeah. Another viewer, Bala Subramanian, is asking, can you mention an example of micro VP project at Gojek at your company?
Yeah, I can. So, by the way, when Gojek started about 9 to 10 years back, it was in a way a micro viable product, because so as you know, Gojek is a it's a mobility, it started as a mobility company that helped users get from point A to point B with a four-wheeler or a two-wheeler. And you would be surprised to know that Gojek for multiple years was just a call center, right? So the users would call the people in the call center to book a cab or a two-wheeler, and the people at call center would say that, okay, we are booked a cab and we sent. There was no mobile app, right? So that is the biggest example of, even before building a product platform, how you can actually test what the users want. So that's an example from Gojek.
Thank you. Sur is asking, design team demands PRD before starting their design. How do we go about this? As you said, the design should not wait for PRD.
Yes. So this is again something that happens in a lot. Uh, Now there are two ways to solve this, and it's a slow change. Do not expect it to happen in a day or a week. It happens over a period of time. When you're writing a PRD as a product manager or as a product analyst, right, or as a project manager, right, in the PRD writing process, always have a section, maybe it's called the design flow or the UI UX flow, where you should invite your designer to contribute to the PRD. So if you're writing a PRD about a particular feature, then how should the design flow or the UI UX look like? Even forget about how the UI look like. What should be the theme of the design, right? What are the pain points we're addressing with the design? Invite your designer into the PRD process. Unless you invite your designers are not going to come to you and say, hey, we want to be part of the PRD process. And every person is trying to learn, right? So designers would love to do some bit of product and understand how do product managers think about it, and product managers would be learning that how designers think. So bring them in the PRD process rather than uh, asking them to basically, hey, this is the PRD, now just build the design for me. And I would say for the designers also, if there are any designers watching this, please be part of the product requirement document or the product discovery process. Do not wait for your product manager or product analyst to give you PRD. Participate in user interviews, participate in the PRD documentation process. So that's a small and a slow way of changing the culture. It will take time, but hopefully that helps. Thank you.
Thank you. And Bhavik Shah is asking, how do we give bigger picture to the team when there is a multitude of hierarchy and it is almost impossible to bring everyone at the same table?
Yeah. Okay. So generally, it is seen that when you change the culture in your company, for example, you want everyone to be on the same page, right? The It's always easy to change people who are hands-on. So someone who's directly working on design, someone who's directly coding. It's easier to bring the change in the people that are hands-on. It's more difficult to bring change in the middle management level because their success might be dependent on the company's culture continuing the way it is, and this is truth, right? So the most difficult line of management to change is the middle management, because they have been got used to a particular line of thinking, whereas the leaders are always open to change, right? uh, if they are not, then yes, it's basically you have to start from the top, but you start from the middle management because that's the easiest bit. And how to bring that change is by doing a small feature or a product or a project where you can showcase this and demonstrate that, hey, when we all get together and work on a particular product feature together, it is faster. And they will not know it or understand it until they have seen it, right? So let's say out of the 11 projects or 11 product features that you roll out in a year, at least for one product feature, bring everyone on board and always start with the middle management. That's where I've read that is the most difficult to change. If the middle management can change, then the upper management is okay with it if the results are good, right? Because if you start delivering faster, the upper management will be okay with the new process. So start with the middle management.
Thank you. Ankush is asking regarding the first question, what are your recommendations for managing client requirements in case of SaaS products which have a longer release cycle?
Yeah. Okay. Uh, yeah. So every uh, product discovery and delivery cycle time varies depending on the kind of product it is, right? And typically in SaaS products, as you rightly said, the delivery cycles are longer, right? Hence, there are two things very important as when you're working with the client. First of all, understand from them in advance, understand what are their key results that they're expecting from you, right? So you can go to your client and not right in the middle of when you're already building something. In the first engagement, and it's never too late. You can engage with your client to understand from them what are the key objectives and key results in the 3 to 6 months or 6 to 9 months or 9 to 12 months time frame. Because it's a SaaS product, talk about longer cycles when you're talking about objectives and key results. Because once you have figured out what are the key results expected from you by the client, you can help them deliver it in at the pace you want, as long as it's getting delivered within the time frame that they're looking at, right? So do not start from the bottom. Have a top down approach. Start with the client's objective key results, then go down to building a roadmap for them which maps to the key results. Get a sort of a temporary approval from the client that this roadmap looks good as per the objective key results. And then every time the client pushes you for changes in the feature or changes in the scope, always refer to the same roadmap that you finalized right in the beginning of the engagement. Because if you do not have a source of truth, which is the objectives and key results and the roadmap, then it can be changed. So make sure that you start with a particular roadmap with your client right in the beginning, so that whenever there are any changes, you can always refer back to it and tell your client, hey, if you want me to change this, what is the other thing that you want us to deprioritize? Or maybe you want more people on my team, so let's increase the engineering bandwidth, for example.
Thank you. Prem Kumar is asking, when we involve too many people in the scoping and product discovery phase, how do we make sure we keep the whole process cohesive and keeping the product roadmap in hindsight?
Yeah. So this is exactly what I was referring to in my presentation. It is easier said than done, right? And there are teams that are able to successfully do this, and there are teams that are far behind, and this all depends on the company culture. Now, let's say you're in a situation you want to, in the product discovery process, you want to do something fast, and hence you are thinking that, hey, I should not involve my policy right now because they will really slow down my product discovery process. Fine. You write down your requirements, you give it to your engineering team for delivery, and then one fine day, the policy person comes to you and says, hey, you know what? Actually, you never consulted me and I want this particular feature. And then later on in the delivery process, you find out that you actually have to stop delivery, find out a new scope that this new person told you about, and then that derails the product delivery. So when I say involve everyone in the room, I do not mean literally having everyone in this single room and asking everyone's advice, but I literally mean that whenever you're writing documents, for example, the product requirement document or the concept testing document, just share the document with everyone, put a timeline to it. So if today at 9 p.m. I'm done with my PRD, I share it with all the relevant stakeholders and tell them that, can you give your comments, your questions, your clarifications by tomorrow 9 p.m., 24 hours? Always have a time bound interaction with your team members and organization, and choose the stakeholders that you want to involve. Not every stakeholder is important for a feature, right? So always have a time bound collaboration. A collaboration that always keeps going on without any outcomes is slower than just basically making sure that you're binding it by a particular time.
Thank you. Gurparavan is asking, why shouldn't we keep in mind the whole supply chain too?
Uh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I need more clarity on that question.
Yes, I think so too. Okay, maybe we'll come back to it later. Srinivas is asking, when you were executing an MVP project in your company, I guess, what you faced, what were the major problems in that process when you were executing an MVP project?
Okay. I would say there are two challenges to any product feature or MVP that you're trying to ship. One is everybody's trying to tell you, hey, we need to add more features to the product, because everyone thinks that if we do not have the perfect product in front of the user will not use it, right? Because if, let's say, you're building a food delivery app, right? There are already so many food delivery apps, and you might be thinking, hey, until I build a full stack food delivery app, I should not ship it, right? So the first challenge that I have faced personally is multiple stakeholders asking you to add more features so that we can get maximum out. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is how to even define an MVP. And I just touched about it shortly in one of the slides, is that MVP is what you can get out of the effort versus impact analysis or workshop. You have to know what is the effort on every user story and what is the impact, right? There are some user stories that will not have impact on the user, but some of them will have more impact. So you choose the stories which are high impact, low effort, or high impact, mid effort, or you choose the user stories that have mid impact but low effort, or mid impact, or mid effort. So you always basically build a matrix to find out that what are the things. But it's not so much true in the practical world as it is easy to say in the theoretical world. But you have to have some sort of a framework where you can define an MVP. So those are the two challenges that I faced.
Thank you. Bala Subramanian is asking, is engineering teams help needed for building a micro VP?
uh, well, the answer is it depends, but I would say you can always have a micro VP without engineering team. And that's what I was referring to another question. Somebody was asking me that, if we do not have a team on day zero, how should we even go about it? Right. And you see, so I can give two examples. You can just work on a small video explaining your concept and put it out there for the world to get the feedback whether users will want something like this or not. One of the great examples is Kickstarter, right? You can put something on Kickstarter without building it, right? Another example is you could build a website, explain the concept, and then have an invite list where people can basically subscribe to you in order to show interest that, hey, whenever this product comes out, I would be interested, even though there's no product right then. So for a micro VP or a micro viable product, you do not always need an engineering team.
Thank you. Gurparavan is asking, what is the scope of out-of-the-box thinking in the whole product cycle from idea to delivery?
Out of the box thinking helps during two phases. One is in the discovery process, you always trying to find out that what is it that is lacking in the market or in the competitor side or in the industry as a whole that you can give to the user. So out of the box thinking makes sense as long as it's meaningful to the user and the business. If it's not meaningful to the user and the business, then out of the box thinking is can basically lead to no results in terms of whatever OKRs or goals that your company is looking for. So I would say that out of the box thinking in the discovery process is included when you're doing the research, understanding what the competitors do not have, and you can completely find very innovative and disruptive ways of doing something for the user. In the product delivery process, out of the box thinking comes on how you can ship the product in the most efficient manner, which is a good quality, not bad quality, as well as at a speed that is okay with everyone in the team. So these are the 2 points where you actually can bring in your out of box thinking.
Thank you. Kumar is asking how to deal with changes in PRD in later stage if they result in major engineering designs.
Yeah, super practical question. Thanks for that. I think it happens all the time for us. The one of the things that I found helpful is that your PRD, if let's say it's a complicated feature and your PRD talks about so many things that you want to do in MVP or in the next rollout, always phase out your PRD, right? So let's say you're building 3 features. You can always in the PRD have a phase one section where you talk about this is what we are going to build and deliver in phase one. If this is successful, this is what we are going to build in phase two, and so on and so forth. So the advantage of doing it is that if later someone comes and does changes to the PRD, as in let's say changes something in the product feature or requires it, they would automatically have to be slotted in the next phase. You cannot change the phase one or phase two. And if there's a new requirement, it always goes down to a particular phase. Now, I'm not saying that this is a rule because sometimes it just happens that the advice or the opinion is actually quite meaningful for the users. And sometimes you might just be okay with the PRD changes because it is something that you might have missed out on your end when you're building the PRD. So there's no rule, but in order to minimize changes, write your PRD in a phase-wise manner, slot your features in a phase-wise manner so that any current phases do not get disrupted.
Thank you. Prem Kumar is asking, when delivery starts feeding into the discovery process, wouldn't it lead to only incremental innovation? Would this approach help organizations trying to come up with the next big idea?
Yes, I think that's you're completely right on point, and that's what is something I was talking about throughout this presentation. And if the delivery is part of the discovery process, it's you know what the users want, right? Because you're delivering a feature, users will use it. You can track where what do the users like to use more, what do the users hate. Go through your customer service complaints, go through your app complaints, try to understand that what do the users like and do not like. If they like something, scale it up. If they do not like, then scale it down. That's why product delivery is such an important part of the discovery process and leads to a lot of innovative solutions for the users.
Thank you. Bharti is asking, how can responsibility of ROI be co-owned between client and provider while defining key results in the beginning to avoid mismatch of expectations later?
Okay. Linda, can you repeat this one, please?
Yeah. How can responsibility of ROI be co-owned between client and the provider while defining key results in the beginning to avoid mismatch of expectations later?
Okay. Now, the objectives and KRs do not make sense if they're not feeding into a goal of the client. Now, let's say, so basis your question seems like if the goal of the client is a particular return on investment, right? Let's say that the client wants X% return on their investment, right? You have to define the X%. For some clients, that X% could mean profit margin. For some clients, it could mean your revenue. For some, it could mean, let's say, your operating profit. So you have to define what that X% is. And then when you're designing the OKR process, you have to have a direct link of the key result to that X%. So let's say we are targeting 10% profit margin till the end of the year. What is the scale at which we want to reach that 10%? Maybe in the first quarter, the focus is only to break even. So the KRs should be related to how to break even. In the next quarter, if you have break even, the KR should be related to how to go to 3% profitability, and then 7, and then 10%. So break your ROI into stages. Each stage should the KRs should contribute to the goals of each stage, and then basically scale up slowly. Keep getting feedback on whether you're on the right track or not, and keep that conversation always open with the client.
Thank you. Bawik is asking, is it possible to define OKR always for MVPs, especially when the key results consist of confidential numbers or hints at exposing those numbers?
Okay. Yeah. Seems like this question is coming from the in a client-facing companies, right? Because if you're defining the KRs within one company where you are not serving a client, it's easier to include confidential information KR. But let's say you're working with a client, in which case if the client is not open to discussing their internal profitability information, for example, then you have to have that open conversation with the client that if the client wants a certain return on their investment, right, you and the client have to define how do you track it, how do you measure it. Maybe the measurement will not happen by looking in the profit and loss or the P&L statement of the client because that's confidential. Maybe you have to have a metric which is much more slightly more public than that, and you have to have that understanding between both of you. I'll give you an example. So if the client is investing, let's say, $100,000 in you, one of the ways both of you can look at a return on that investment is that how many new users you were able to get the client over the same period of time. Now, number of users that you could help get that client over a period of time is less confidential information than what is the revenue and the cost or the profit that you could get it. So always find out those metrics which are easy to track rather than metrics which, let's say, could be confidential. Quite a good
Thank you.
question.
Srinivas is asking, what is the best project deliverable execution in your experience, majorly with UX, UI, agile process, sprint by sprint, or any waterfall model, or is it based on the project?
Yeah. So Agile is just a framework, right? And when we are discussing deliverables, it always depends on the project rather than there's no one answer to it. I think there was a similar question earlier in which the question was that how do you even define KRs, for example, for each project? So it depends. In case of a UI, in case a UI UX is part of a project, one way to define a KR is basically what you're looking at from the UI UX process. I'll give you an example. Suppose you are worried that users are not converting from one screen to another. Let's say it's an activation process, and the user is not activating your product, right? One of the KRs for the UI UX team members could be that grow activations by X% when a new user goes through the activation process, right? So UI UX have to design this new design flow in a way that it leads to that increment. So depends on the product, depends on the project, but and depends on the problem statement at hand, basically.
Thank you. And the last question in this session will come from Ankush. He's asking, at Gojek, do product teams own QA, UAT? I have experienced that QA teams and product teams don't add synergy to the product delivery. What can you recommend based on your experience?
Yeah. So the QA has a very important role in product delivery, and sometimes it's underestimated. One of the ways product and QA can actually coordinate together is one thing that QAs know well is what are the loopholes that are possible in the user flow. And you may like it or not, but QAs know it better than you if a QA is experienced and they have been part of the product for long. So one way that you can actually do better user stories is, let's say you write a user story and you write your acceptance criterias about these are the things that should always happen when user does this, given when and then. Invite your QA into the user story process, and it can be a good challenging game, right, where you can ask the QA that, hey, can you point out if I missed out an acceptance criteria for a user story and you think it could have been beneficial for the user. And if the QA is able to, let's say, add value to the user story, you have already had a great collaboration. So when the user story gets developed and the QA starts taking role in the QA process, they've already seen all the acceptance criteria. So they will never go back and say that, hey, you missed out on acceptance criteria. So because QAs know about the loopholes more, you can invite them in the story writing process, have your QA or the acceptance criteria is written in an exhaustive manner, and that's how you can work better.
Okay,